3 weeks after everything. That is where we are. 3 weeks after her father's name was in every newspaper that mattered. 3 weeks after Leo stopped texting. 3 weeks after she dropped her old phone off a penthouse balcony and watched it disappear into the dark below and felt nothing. Just clean air and the sound of the city not caring. 3 weeks, and she was still here. That was the part she had not planned for. See, Aaliyah had planned everything else. She had planned the legal strategy. She had planned the evidence. She had planned exactly how her father's face would look when he understood that the daughter he used as a liability had become the one thing he could not outmaneuver. She had planned all of it down to the last document, and it had gone exactly the way she designed it. What she had not planned was the morning after, or the morning after that, or the one after that. She had not planned what it would feel like to wake up in a penthouse that was not hers, in a life that did not have a name yet, next to a silence that belonged to a man she had told herself, repeatedly, carefully, out loud inside her own head, was simply a business arrangement. A contract. That was all. Except this morning she had woken up at 5:47 a.m. and the first thing her brain did, before coffee, before logic, before the part of her that had a medical degree and knew better, was register that she could not hear him moving anywhere in the apartment. And her chest did something. Something small. Something she felt before she could name it. Something that sat between her ribs for exactly 3 seconds before she got up, walked to the kitchen, and found him standing at the window with his back to her, coffee in hand, watching the city wake up the same way she had watched it every morning for 3 weeks. He didn't turn around. "You were up early," he said. "So were you," she said. He turned then, just slightly, enough that she could see the edge of his jaw, the corner of his expression. "I'm always up early, Aaliyah." She knew that. She knew his schedule better than she knew her own at this point. She knew he took his coffee black and too hot. She knew he read physical documents instead of screens before 7 a.m. She knew the exact quality of silence that meant he was thinking versus the one that meant he had already decided. She knew which rooms he moved through first in the morning and the specific sound his footsteps made on the hallway floor outside her door that told her what kind of night the organization had given him. She knew all of that, and standing in that kitchen in the early gray light, she understood, with the same cold clarity she used to diagnose things she didn't want to be true, that you did not learn those things about a person because of a contract. You learned them because you were paying attention, because you wanted to. The contract had been over for 3 weeks. She was still paying attention. That was the problem she had not planned for. And it was standing 6 feet away from her in a dark shirt, drinking coffee like it had no idea what it was doing to her, which somehow made it worse. I need you to stay with me for this one. Because part 1 was about Aaliyah surviving, and it's in the link in the comment or description. Just click it and watch part 1 just in case you haven't. Part 2 is about something she never saw coming. Something more dangerous than her father, more complicated than a contract, and something she has absolutely no medical training for. Subscribe if you are not already and drop a comment right now. Did you think she was going to walk away? Because I have been reading your comments, and most of you already knew she was staying. You knew before she did. Let's go. Aaliyah had a plan. She had always had a plan. That was the thing about her. Even in the worst moments of her life, the part of her brain that had survived 4 years of medical school on discipline and stubbornness alone kept running quietly in the background, generating next steps, calculating exits, finding the most logical path forward. The plan was simple. Find an apartment, a good one, not too close to the hospital she had accepted a residency position at, not too far. Something with natural light and a kitchen she could actually cook in, and walls that belonged to nobody she had ever needed protection from. She had the money now. Conde had made sure of that, quietly, without being asked, the way he did most things that mattered. She had tried to raise it once, and he had looked at her with that specific expression that meant the conversation was already finished. "You saved my life in an alley," he had said. "The least I can do is make sure you can afford to live in one." She had almost smiled, had stopped herself. That was 3 weeks ago. She had looked at 4 apartments since then, all of them fine, all of them perfectly adequate, all of them exactly what she had described wanting. She had not put a deposit on any of them. She told herself it was because she was busy. The residency orientation started in 2 weeks. She had paperwork, she had things to organize, she had a life to rebuild from scratch, and that took time and energy, and she was simply being practical about the timeline. She told herself that. She almost believed it. What she did not tell herself, what she refused to follow to its logical conclusion, was that every time she stood in one of those apartments with the estate agent talking about light fixtures and storage and proximity to public transport, she was doing a specific calculation. Not about the apartment, about the quiet. The particular quality of silence in each of those spaces. Whether it felt full or empty. Whether it felt like the kind of quiet that meant safety or the kind that meant alone. None of them felt right, and she knew, with the same diagnostic certainty she applied to everything else, exactly why. She just wasn't ready to say it out loud yet. Kangdae found her at the kitchen table that evening with 4 apartment brochures spread in front of her and her coffee going cold again for the second time that day. He looked at the brochures, then at her face. He didn't say anything for a moment. Then he pulled out the chair across from her and sat down, picked up the brochure on top, looked at it with the same focused attention he gave everything. "This one has no windows in the bedroom," he said. "I know." "This one is 2 blocks from a construction site that will run for the next 18 months. "I know." He set them both down, looked at her. "Aaliyah." "I'm working on it," she said quickly. He was quiet for a moment, that specific quiet, the one that meant he had already decided something but was giving her space to arrive at it herself. She hated that quiet. She also knew it better than almost anything. "There's no timeline," he said finally. "Stay until you find the right one." Simple. No weight attached. No suggestion of anything beyond the practical surface of the words. She nodded, looked back at the brochures. "Thank you," she said. He stood up, walked back toward his office, paused in the doorway. "The one on Meridian Street," he said without turning around. "3rd floor, south-facing. The kitchen is the right size for someone who actually cooks." She stared at the back of his head. He had looked at the listings, not just the one in his hand. All of them. He had looked at all of them and formed an opinion and filed it away and said nothing until she needed to hear it. She sat with that for a long time after he left the room. Her phone buzzed. Unknown number. She almost ignored it. Something made her answer. The voice on the other end was female, careful, and spoke with the specific precision of someone who had rehearsed what they were going to say. "Doctor. Aaliyah. My name is Sayan. I work for Kangdae's uncle. I think there are things about the man you are living with that you deserve to know. Meet me tomorrow. Come alone." Aaliyah almost didn't go. She sat with that phone call for 14 hours, turned it over in her mind the way she turned over a difficult diagnosis, looking at it from every angle, testing every interpretation, asking herself what she actually knew versus what she was assuming. What she knew. Kangdae had an uncle. She had found the photograph 3 weeks ago. Her father's face in that drawer, already documented, already dated, already known. Kangdae had been building a file on her family before she ever walked into his life. What she assumed. That he had told her everything relevant. That the 3 weeks since the contract ended had been honest ones. That the man who stood at her kitchen window every morning drinking black coffee and reading physical documents was not keeping something from her that she needed to know. She was a diagnostician. She did not make decisions based on assumptions. She went. The cafe was small and white and deliberately unremarkable. The kind of place chosen specifically because nobody who mattered would think to look for anyone there. Sayan was already seated when Aaliyah arrived. Late 30s, precise posture. The careful stillness of someone who had spent years in rooms where the wrong movement had consequences. She waited until Aaliyah sat down. "How much do you know about the Park family?" she asked. "Enough," Aaliyah said. "Do you know that Kangdae's uncle has been building a case against him for 8 months? Not internally, externally. He has been feeding information to a prosecutor's office in exchange for immunity and a clean exit from the organization." Aaliyah kept her expression clinical. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because the case is not just about Kangdae." Sayun slid a thin folder across the table. "It includes you, your name, your medical credentials, your presence in his residence. They are building a narrative that you are not a protected party. You are a participant." Aaliyah looked at the folder, did not open it yet. "Who sent you?" "Nobody sent me. I came because I have worked for that family for 11 years, and I know the difference between a man who deserves what is coming and one who doesn't." A pause. "Kangdae doesn't know about the prosecutor. He knows his uncle is moving against him internally. He does not know how far outside the organization it has gone." "Why not tell him directly?" "Because his uncle has people watching every contact Kangdae trusts. If I go to him directly, the information dies with me." She looked at Aaliyah steadily. "But you are not in their file as a trusted contact. You are in their file as a liability. Nobody is watching you the same way." Aaliyah opened the folder. Her name, her medical license number, her address, the penthouse address, dates, times, a photograph of her entering the building taken from across the street, timestamp visible, 2 weeks ago. She closed it. "How long do we have?" "The prosecutor is filing within 30 days. Aaliyah sat back, let the information settle the way she let a difficult diagnosis settle, not panicking, just recalibrating, adjusting the picture. One thought surfaced above everything else. He had protected her from her father. He had built a wall between her and everything that was trying to bury her. Now something was coming for him, and he didn't know. "I'll handle it," she said. Soyeon looked at her for a moment. Something shifted in her expression, not surprise exactly, more like recognition. "He chose well," she said quietly, almost to herself. Aaliyah walked out of that cafe with the folder under her arm and her mind already moving, building the strategy, mapping the timeline, calculating what she needed and how fast she needed to get it. She was halfway to the car when she stopped, because she had just realized something. Something that landed with the specific weight of things that change everything. Kangdae had known about her father 3 months before graduation night. He had a photograph, a date, a file, which meant one thing. Her ending up in that alley with him, bleeding in the rain, had been the one thing in all of it that nobody had planned, including him. She stood on that pavement in the cold and thought about that for a long time. Then she got in the car and drove back to the penthouse. She had work to do. But first, she had a question that needed an answer. He was in his office when she got back. Door open, which meant he was working, but not on anything that required absolute privacy. She had learned that too. Closed door meant do not knock. Open door meant he was available, even if he looked like he wasn't. She knocked anyway. He looked up. She walked in, set the folder on his desk, and sat down across from him without waiting to be invited. He looked at the folder, then at her face. She watched him read the cover, the name of the prosecutor's office, the case reference number, and watched something move behind his eyes that he controlled before it became visible. Almost controlled. She caught it. "How long have you known?" she asked. 3 days. "And you didn't tell me." "I was working on it." "Kangdae." She said his name the way she used instruments, precisely, with intention. "My name is in that file. My medical license, my address. Whatever this is, it stopped being just your problem the moment they put my name on a document." He was quiet. That was not the deciding quiet or the already concluded quiet. That was something she had not seen before. something that looked almost like guilt wearing the mask of stillness. "I know," he said. "Then talk to me." He leaned back, looked at her for a long moment in the way he did when he was deciding how much truth the situation required. "My uncle has been building this for 8 months. The prosecutor is legitimate. He is not someone I can reach. The case they are constructing is designed to be untouchable because it does not rely on anything directly connected to the organization. It relies on proximity, association, the people around me." "Me," she said. "You." He said it plainly, no softening. "If you had left 3 weeks ago when the contract ended, none of this would touch you." The room was very quiet. "Is that why you told me there was no timeline?" she asked. Her voice was steady. She was proud of that. "To give me time to get out before it reached me?" He did not answer immediately, which was its own answer. She stood up, walked to the window. The city below, the same city, always moving, always indifferent. She stood there for a moment with her back to him and thought about the woman she was 3 weeks ago standing on this same balcony dropping a phone into the dark. That woman had nothing left to lose. She had walked into Kang Dae's world with empty hands and no future and nothing anyone could use against her. She turned around. "I'm not leaving," she said. "Aaliyah, I'm not leaving, and I'm not a liability. I'm the only person in your organization with the specific skill set to build a case that makes theirs fall apart before it gets filed. So you have 2 options." She picked up the folder. "You can keep trying to protect me from a distance and handle this alone, the way you handle everything. Or you can sit down, tell me everything you know, and let me actually help you." He looked at her for a long time. Something in his face, that sealed, managed, carefully maintained stillness, shifted. Just slightly, just enough. "Sit down," he said. She sat. "From the beginning," she said. He told her. He talked for 2 hours. She listened the way she listened to everything, completely, without interrupting, filing every detail in the correct category. When he finished, the room was dark. Neither of them had turned on a light. They had been sitting in the gathering dark across from each other, and she had not noticed until now. She stood to turn on the lamp. He stood at the same moment. They ended up closer than either of them had intended, not touching, but close enough that she could see the exact expression on his face. And what was on his face in that moment, unguarded, unmanaged, completely unintentional, was something she had no clinical term for. She stepped back, turned on the lamp, sat back down. "I'll start on the counterfiling tomorrow," she said. Her voice was completely even. "Okay," he said. His was too. But neither of them looked at each other again for the rest of the evening, and Aaliyah lay awake until 3 a.m., understanding that the uncle and the prosecutor were not actually the most dangerous thing in this apartment. 3 days into building the counter case, and Aaliyah found the second problem. She had been working from the guest room she had converted into a workspace, documents spread across the desk, her laptop open to 3 different legal databases simultaneously, the kind of focused immersion that reminded her of exam season, except with significantly higher stakes than a grade. She had the prosecutor's file, she had Kang Dae's internal records, everything he had trusted her with, which she understood was not a small thing. She had Soyeon as a source. She had her own medical credentials which gave her access to certain documentation channels that a lawyer or a criminal organization simply did not have. What she did not have was time. 27 days until the filing. She had been counting since the cafe. She was on day 3 when she found the inconsistency. It was small, the kind of thing that would not register to someone who was not specifically looking for it. A discrepancy in the timestamps on a series of internal communications that had been provided to the prosecutor as evidence. The timestamps were wrong, not by much. 40 minutes on one document, 22 minutes on another. Small enough to look like administrative error. But Aaliyah did not believe in administrative error when the documents in question were specifically the ones designed to place Kang Dae at the scene of something he had not been at. Someone inside the organization had altered those timestamps. Not the uncle. The uncle was outside now. He had his immunity deal and his clean exit and no reason to risk it by touching evidence directly. Someone else had done this. Someone still inside. Someone with access to the original documents and enough technical knowledge to alter them without leaving an obvious trail. She took the discrepancy to Kang Dae that evening. He looked at it for a long time. "Park Shin-woo," he said quietly. "You already knew." "I suspected. I didn't have proof." She slid the comparison document across the desk. "You do now." He looked at it, then at her. Something moved across his expression. Not gratitude exactly. Something quieter and more complicated than gratitude. "You found this in 3 days," he said. "I told you, I'm a diagnostician. I find things that are trying not to be found." He was quiet for a moment. "Aaliyah." The way he said her name, not sharp, not directive, just present, like her name in his mouth was something he was paying attention to. She looked up. "Why are you doing this?" She knew what he was asking, not the practical why. She had answered that already. He was asking the real question, the one that had been sitting in the room between them since the night in the dark when neither of them had looked at each other. She held his gaze for exactly as long as she could afford to. "Because you didn't leave me in that alley," she said. "You could have. Your men came and you could have taken what I did for you and let me walk back into the rain and never thought about me again. But you didn't." She looked back at the documents. "Consider this mutual." He did not respond immediately. When she looked up again, he was still watching her with that expression she did not have a clinical term for. "Park Shin-woo will deny it," he said finally. Back to business, both of them choosing it simultaneously. "He will," she agreed. "Which is why we are not going to confront him directly. We are going to let him think he is invisible for exactly 9 more days while I build something he cannot deny. Then we take him and the uncle and the prosecutor's case apart at the same time." Kang Dae looked at her for a long moment. "You have a specific kind of mind," he said. "I know." "I mean that as the highest possible compliment." She felt something move in her chest, small. 3 seconds. The same thing as the morning in the kitchen. She did not acknowledge it. 9 days, she said. "Let me work." If you are still here, thank you. Seriously. This story is building into something and I need you with me for the second half. Subscribe if you haven't already and drop 1 word in the comments right now. 1 word that describes Aaliyah at this exact moment in the story. I am reading every single one. Now let's keep going. She came on a Tuesday. Aaliyah knew it was her before she opened the door. Not because she had been expecting it, she hadn't, but because the knock had a specific quality. Uncertain. Too long between the first and second rap. The knock of someone who had rehearsed coming here and was still not sure they should have. She opened the door. Her sister looked smaller. That was the first thing. Not physically smaller, but the specific kind of diminishment that happens to people when the performance they have been maintaining their entire life finally becomes too expensive to keep up. The carefully constructed ease was gone, the calculated softness, the tilt and the timing and the laugh she saved for rooms she wanted to own. What was left underneath was just a person, tired, uncertain, standing in a doorway she had no right to be standing in. "Aaliyah, how did you get this address?" Her sister looked at her feet. "Leo had it. From before." Aaliyah made a note of that and filed it for later. "What do you want?" Her sister stopped, started again. "I wanted to see you." "Why?" "Because you're my sister?" The word landed in the space between them and neither of them quite knew what to do with it. Sister. The same word that had meant safety once, a long time ago, before Aaliyah understood that safety in her family had always been conditional, and she had simply been the last to find out. She looked at her sister's face. Really looked. The tiredness was real. The uncertainty was real. But Aaliyah had spent her whole life accepting real emotion as sufficient reason to lower her guard, and she was done with that particular habit. "Are you in trouble?" she asked. Her sister's eyes filled. "The apartment, Are you in trouble? Aaliyah repeated. Specifically, what kind? Leo left. He took the money from the joint account we had set up. All of it. I have 30 days before I lose the apartment, and I don't have... Did you come here for money? Silence. Did you come here to apologize? Or did you come here for money? Her sister looked up. Something crossed her face. Shame trying to coexist with desperation, neither of them winning. Both? She said finally. At least it was honest. Aaliyah stood in the doorway and thought about the lecture hall, the yellow dress, the way her sister had looked over Leo's shoulder with that expression that was not guilt, the graduation dinner, the 7 voicemails she had never listened to. She thought about all of it. I'm not giving you money, she said. Not today. Not because I want you to suffer. I don't. But because money is not what either of us actually needs from this conversation. Her sister swallowed, nodded. You can come in, Aaliyah said, for an hour. We are going to have the conversation we have never actually had. Not the version where you apologize and I absorb it and we pretend the surface is the whole story. The real one. Her sister stepped inside. Aaliyah closed the door. They sat across from each other in the living room for 40 minutes, and her sister said things Aaliyah had never heard before. Not excuses, not the managed version of events. Real things. Things about growing up in the shadow of Aaliyah's excellence. About their father's specific cruelty toward the daughter he considered less useful. About Leo, who had found her sister in a vulnerable moment and had been deliberately, calculatedly kind in a way that her sister now understood had nothing to do with love and everything to do with access. Aaliyah listened, did not soften, did not harden either, just listened. And when her sister finally went quiet, Aaliyah said, I believe you. That doesn't make what you did okay. Both of those things are true at the same time. Her sister nodded. They sat in silence. And then, from the hallway, the sound of a door. Kang Dae's footsteps. The particular quality of them that Aaliyah knew meant he had been home for longer than her sister knew. He appeared in the living room doorway, looked at the sister, then at Aaliyah. His expression asked a question without words. Aaliyah answered it the same way. It's fine. I have it. He nodded once, disappeared back down the hallway. Her sister stared after him, then looked at Aaliyah with an expression that was not envy this time, something closer to awe. He checked on you, her sister said quietly. He heard voices and he checked on you. Aaliyah said nothing, but her chest did that thing again, the small thing, and this time it lasted longer than 3 seconds. 9 days moved differently than normal days. Aaliyah had experienced compressed time before, the specific acceleration of medical emergencies where everything narrowed to the next correct action and the clock became irrelevant. This was similar but not identical. This had a dual quality. On the surface, focused, precise, methodical. The counter case building document by document, source by source, the timestamps on Park Shin-woo's alterations mapped against the original server logs that So-yeon had quietly obtained from inside the organization. Underneath, something else entirely. Something that had nothing to do with prosecutors or uncles or rats in the organization. She and Kang Dae had developed a rhythm. She did not know exactly when it had happened. Somewhere between the late nights and the early mornings and the meals that had started appearing on her desk when she forgot to eat, and the conversations that began as tactical briefings and ended as something else. Longer, quieter, neither of them looking at the clock. She would be working and he would appear in the doorway, not interrupting, just present. Sometimes he stayed, sometimes he left. The distinction had started to matter to her in a way she could not justify clinically. On the 5th day, he brought her coffee at 11 p.m. without being asked, set it on the desk, looked at what she was working on, said, "The secondary filing. You're building the challenge to jurisdiction before the primary case even lands. If we challenge jurisdiction first, the primary case has nowhere to go," she said. He was quiet for a moment. "That is exactly what I would have done." She looked up. He was looking at her with that expression again. The one from the dark room, the one she had been carefully not looking at directly. "Kang Dae," Yes? Stop looking at me like that when I'm trying to work. A beat of silence. Then, and she would think about this moment for a long time afterward, the corner of his mouth moved. Not a smile exactly, something more contained than a smile, and more genuine than anything she had seen on his face in 6 months. Like what? He said. She looked back at her screen. You know like what? He said nothing, but he did not leave either. He pulled out the chair across from her and sat down and opened his own laptop, and they worked in silence for 2 more hours, and it was the most comfortable 2 hours she had experienced since before graduation night, and she hated how much she noticed that. On the 7th day, Park Shin-woo made his move. She heard about it from Kangdae at 6 a.m., the specific kind of early morning appearance that meant something had happened in the night. Shin-woo had accessed the server again, not to alter documents this time, to delete them. He had not known about the mirror archive Aaliyah had quietly established on day 4. He deleted the originals, Kangdae said. He deleted copies of the originals, she said. I have the real ones. He stared at her. You anticipated this. I diagnosed it. There is a difference. She pulled up the archive. He panicked on day 6. I could see it in the pattern of his access logs. He was checking the documents too frequently. Someone who is confident does not check. He was looking for signs that someone had found what he did. When he didn't find any, he decided to eliminate the evidence entirely. She turned the screen toward him. He just handed us everything. Kangdae looked at the screen, then at her. Aaliyah. Don't, she said. I haven't said anything. You were going to say something. I was going to say thank you. She looked at him. Oh, she said. Yes, he said. They looked at each other for a moment in the early gray light of a morning that felt different from the other mornings, and neither of them looked away first. Her phone rang. So-yun. She answered immediately. The voice on the other end was not So-yun's. It was male. Careful. Deliberate. Dr. Aaliyah, I think you have something that belongs to my client. We would like to discuss terms of return. The uncle, calling her directly, which meant one of 2 things. Either he did not know she had already built something that made his case irrelevant, or he did know, and this was not a negotiation, it was a warning. She kept her voice completely level. I don't negotiate on behalf of anyone, she said, but I will pass the message along. She ended the call, set the phone down, looked at Kangdae. Your uncle just called my personal number. Something shifted in his face immediately, not the usual controlled shift, something real and sharp and cold in a way she had not seen before. He called you directly. Yes. Kangdae stood up slowly. When he spoke, his voice was the quietest she had ever heard it. He crossed a line. And standing there in that kitchen at 6 a.m., Aaliyah understood that whatever was coming next was no longer just about documents and prosecutors and timestamps. It had just become personal. And personal, she had learned, was where Kangdae was most dangerous. The uncle wanted a meeting, not a call, a physical meeting. Neutral location, his choice, 48 hours notice. The message came through back channels, not to Kangdae directly, but to 3 of his most senior people simultaneously, which meant it was designed to be visible. Designed to look like a reasonable offer extended through proper channels. Kangdae saw it for what it was immediately. He is not offering a meeting, he said. He is demonstrating that he still has access to my organization. And testing whether you will refuse, Aaliyah said. If you refuse, you look afraid. If you accept, you walk into a room of his choosing. Which is why we are going to do neither. He had a third option. He always had a third option. That was something she had learned about the way his mind worked. Most people operated in binaries. Kangdae operated in the space between options, finding exits that weren't visible until he pointed at them. The third option was to file first. Not the full counter case, not yet. A preliminary injunction. Something surgical and specific that froze the prosecutor's ability to add new evidence while simultaneously calling into question the chain of custody on everything already submitted. It would not end the case, but it would stop the clock, give them time, take the uncle's leverage, and quietly remove the mechanism that gave it power. It required her medical credentials as a co-signatory on 3 of the documents. He asked her directly, no softening, no framing, just, I need your name on this, your credentials. If anything goes wrong, you are exposed. She looked at the documents, then at him. I know, she said, and signed. Something moved across his face when she did that. She filed it away. They filed the injunction at 4 p.m. By 9 p.m., the prosecutor's office had received it, the uncle had been notified, and Park Shin-woo had gone completely silent on every communication channel, which Kande's people read as confirmation that he understood it was over. It should have felt like victory. It mostly did. Except that at 11 p.m., Aaliyah was sitting on the living room floor with her back against the couch because she had been sitting in chairs for 14 hours, and her body needed to be closer to the ground, and Kangdae found her there. And instead of asking what was wrong, he simply sat down on the floor beside her. Not close enough to touch, close enough to be present. They sat like that for a while. Are you okay? He said eventually. Yes, she said. No, I don't know. That's honest. I put my name on those documents, she said. My license, everything I worked for. I did it without hesitating and I don't regret it, and I also... She stopped. Also what? She turned and looked at him, right there on the floor at 11 p.m., with the city outside doing its indifferent city things, and the injunction filed, and the uncle neutralized, and the rat exposed, and all of it. All the strategy and the documents and the counterfilings, done. I also did not do it for mutual, she said quietly. I told you in that office it was mutual. It wasn't. He looked at her. What was it? He said. His voice was very quiet. She held his gaze. I think you know what it was, she said. The room was completely still. He reached over, slowly, not sudden, not demanding, giving her every opportunity to move away, and his hand covered hers where it rested on the floor between them. He did not say anything, neither did she. They sat there like that, on the floor, in the dark, his hand over hers, and the city moved outside and neither of them needed to name it yet, and somehow that was exactly right. Her phone buzzed on the coffee table above them. She reached up without looking and turned it face down. He watched her do that. You're not going to check it? No, she said. Whatever it is, it can wait. It was the first time in her adult life she had said that and meant it completely. He looked at her for a long moment, then he turned his phone face down too. And they stayed on that floor for another hour and the world outside kept going, and for once Aaliyah let it go without her. The hearing was at 10 a.m. Aaliyah was up at 5. Not anxiously, she had moved past anxious somewhere around day 6 of the 9 days. This was something else. The specific alertness of someone who had prepared completely and was now simply waiting for the preparation to meet the moment. She was dressed by 6:15. Dark blazer, dark trousers, the specific uniform of someone who intended to be taken seriously in a room full of people who would prefer to dismiss her. Kangdae was already in the kitchen. Of course he was. She looked at him across the counter. Dark suit, the good one, the one that made him look like someone the city had been built around. He looked back at her with that expression she now had a name for, even if she hadn't said the name out loud yet. You look like you've already won, he said. I have already won, she said. The hearing is just confirmation. The corner of his mouth. She looked away before it became a full smile. She was not ready for a full smile from him at 6 a.m. She had limits. The hearing lasted 40 minutes. The judge reviewed the preliminary injunction, the chain of custody challenge, the timestamp evidence, the mirror archive, the affidavit from So-yeon, whose name had been redacted from the prosecutor's version of events in a way that itself constituted a procedural violation. 40 minutes. The prosecutor's case was suspended pending full review of evidence handling. Park Shin-woo was named in a separate fraud inquiry. The uncle's immunity deal was referred back for reassessment given the new information about the evidence he had provided. It did not end everything. There would be more proceedings, more filings. The organization's relationship with the law was not something that resolved in a single morning, but the immediate threat was gone. Kang Dae was not going to be touched today, or this month, and by the time the reassessment was complete, Aaliyah would have built something that made the whole case structurally impossible. She knew that. He knew that. They walked out of the building side by side into the kind of morning that does not know or care about legal proceedings. Bright, cold, indifferent. He stopped on the steps. She stopped beside him. "Aaliyah." She turned. He was looking at her in full daylight in a way he had only done in dark rooms and early mornings before now. No management, no careful stillness, just him, looking at her. "I need to tell you something," he said. "Okay," she said. "I knew about your father for 3 months before that night. I had the photograph. I was building a case against him for reasons that had nothing to do with you." "I know," she said. "I figured that out at the cafe." "When you ended up in that alley..." "It was an accident," she said. "I know that too." "Yes," he paused. "But what happened after, it wasn't." She looked at him. "Every decision I made after that alley," he said, "the contract, the protection, keeping you close, none of that was strategy. I told myself it was. For approximately 3 days, I genuinely believed it was." A pause. "I was incorrect." She almost smiled. "How long?" she said. "How long what?" "How long did you know it wasn't strategy?" He considered this with the seriousness he gave everything. "The night you stitched my side and told me a man with a gun was the least of your worries," he said. "I knew then." She stood on those steps in the cold morning light and thought about an alley in the rain and a man bleeding in the mud and a woman who couldn't make herself walk away. "That was the first night," she said. "Yes," he said. "You waited 6 months. You needed the space. Simply, factually. I could see that, so I waited." She looked at him for a long time. This man who had counted her sleep hours and looked at apartment listings and turned his phone face down on the floor and waited. 6 months, without pressure, without demanding anything, because he could see that she needed the space to become someone who could choose freely. "Kang Dae," she said. "Yes." "Stop talking." She stepped forward, closed the distance she had been maintaining for 6 months, and she kissed him on the steps of a courthouse in the cold morning light, with the city moving around them exactly the way it always did, unhurried, indifferent, honest. He kissed her back, not surprised, not rushed, like he had been ready for exactly this long enough that the moment itself was simply arrival. When she stepped back, his expression was the most unguarded she had ever seen it, open in a way that made her understand. This man who was feared by everyone, who moved through the world in sealed, managed stillness, had been holding something carefully for a very long time. "We should go," she said. Her voice was not entirely steady. His wasn't either when he said yes. They walked down the steps together, not touching, but the distance between them was different now, smaller, chosen. And at the bottom of the steps, his hand found hers without either of them looking down. She did not pull away. They walked to the car like that, the city moving around them, indifferent and unhurried as always, completely unaware that something had just become permanent. 1 month later. The residency started on a Tuesday. Aaliyah walked into the hospital at 7 a.m. in her white coat with her name on the chest pocket, Dr. Aaliyah, and felt the specific weight of 4 years of work landing correctly for the first time. Not performed, not endured, just hers. Something she had built and nobody could revoke. The apartment on Meridian Street was hers too now. 3rd floor, south-facing. The kitchen the right size for someone who actually cooked. She had signed the lease on a Wednesday morning with coffee from the penthouse still warm in her system and a text from Kang Dae that said only, Good choice, because she had sent him the address, and he had known immediately which one it was. She did not live there yet. She was working on the timeline. Her sister called on a Thursday, not to ask for anything, just to call. They had been doing that twice a week since the conversation in the living room. Short calls, careful ones, the kind that were rebuilding something very slowly from very basic materials. It was not forgiveness exactly. It was something more honest than forgiveness. A decision to see each other clearly and keep going anyway. It was enough, for now. Her father remained where she had put him. She did not call. She did not visit. She had made her peace with that. Not the peace of someone who had stopped feeling, but the peace of someone who had decided that her own life was not a sacrifice she owed anyone. That decision had taken 22 years. It had taken one night in an alley in the rain to begin to understand it. On a Friday evening, 4 weeks after the courthouse steps, she cooked dinner in the penthouse kitchen for the last time. She knew it was the last time. She was moving into Meridian Street the following week, and they had both decided, without discussing it directly, that the penthouse would remain his space and Meridian Street would remain hers, and the distance between them would be exactly what they chose it to be on any given day. Some days it would be the distance between two apartments. Some days it would be no distance at all. He came in while she was cooking and stood at the counter the way he always did, present, unhurried, watching her move through a space with the ease of someone who had learned it completely. "You're going to be good at this," he said. "Cooking?" "The residency." She looked at him. "I know." "That wasn't arrogance," he said. "That was a fact." "I know that too." He came around the counter, stood beside her. Close enough. The right distance. She had learned his distances the way she had learned everything else about him, by paying attention, by wanting to. "I've been thinking," he said. "About?" "Your father's clinic. The one he used to launder the funds. The building is clean now, legally. The license is available." She set down the spoon, looked at him. "You want to open a clinic?" "I want you to open a clinic," he said. "When the residency is done. Something that belongs to you. That serves the community that was supposed to protect you and didn't." A pause. "I can handle the infrastructure. You handle the medicine." She looked at him for a long time. This was who he was. Not the newspaper version, not the feared name. The man who turned his phone face down on the floor and waited 6 months and looked at apartment listings and thought about a clinic while she was still figuring out her residency schedule. "You've been planning this for a while," she said. "A few weeks." "Why didn't you say anything?" "You needed the space," he said simply. "You always need the space first." She looked at him, at this man who had learned her, specifically, carefully, completely, without being asked and without announcing it. "Kangde," she said. "Yes?" "I'm not going to need as much space going forward." Something in his face settled, like a thing that had been held carefully for a long time being set down gently. "Good," he said. She went back to cooking. He stayed beside her. The city moved outside the windows. The penthouse held its particular quiet, full, not empty, not the absence of sound, but the presence of something that had chosen to stay. Aaliyah thought about a girl in a graduation gown with a speech in her hand and a world that was ending. She thought about an alley in the rain. She thought about 11 minutes in a parked car outside a house that had never been a home, counting because counting was the only anchor she had. She was not that girl anymore. She was not performing. She was not enduring. She was not making herself smaller or quieter or easier to keep around. She was a doctor. She was a woman who had rebuilt her life from the wreckage of one night and made it into something nobody could touch. And she was standing in a kitchen next to a man who had never once asked her to be anything other than exactly what she was. That was everything. That was more than enough. That was the empire she had actually been building all along, not made of power or fear or leverage, made of clarity, made of choice, made of the specific knowledge that she had walked through the worst night of her life and come out the other side as someone she was not ashamed of. She plated the food. He poured 2 glasses of water, not wine, just water, because that was what she had been drinking since Tuesday, and he had noticed without being told. They sat at the table. Outside, the city moved the way it always did. Neither of them needed it to mean anything. It was enough. Aaliyah started part 1 with a speech falling out of her hands and a family that used her silence against her. She ends part 2 with her name on a white coat, a clinic coming, and a man beside her who learned her without being asked. That is not a fairy tale. That is what it looks like when a woman decides, fully, finally, with no performance and no apology, that her own life belongs to her. If this story meant something to you, drop a comment below. Tell me what Aaliyah gave you across these 2 parts. Tell me what you needed to hear. I read every single one. And if you are new here, part 1 is waiting for you in the comment or description. Click the link. Subscribe, stay. There are more women like Aaliyah in this world than anyone gives credit for. And every single one of them deserves a story.